Hey everybody, Dr. Lund here. We've been talking about literature this week, including young adult literature, and I've talked about how important it is to teach young adult literature. Young adult literature can be controversial, and it can be controversial from people for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes in the news or on social media, we tend to hear about reasons from one side or the other. We looked at a left-right spectrum, which is an oversimplified spectrum. But in reality, any work of literature can potentially raise complaints from somebody. And when we look at things like most banned book lists or most challenged book lists, it's really easy to say, oh, well, all these complaints are coming from the right or from the left. But in reality, different books are challenged or banned from both sides. And it is, in my opinion, equally bad, regardless of which side it's coming from. So if you have a parent or guardian um, or someone else, unfortunately, who might question a book that you've chosen, or a short story you've chosen, or a poem you've chosen, or that you've made available to students, what should you do? One thing to do is to be transparent. Explain ahead of time if you're using a text that you think is going to potentially cause controversy. Explain why you're choosing to use it. I mentioned in my young adult lit video about I ended that with the idea of windows and mirrors and how it's important to provide windows into other experiences as well as mirrors into readers' own experiences. That might be a reason to use a text that might be controversial, but at the same time, I think it's important to consider local norms. And I would not choose a text, particularly to teach, if I thought it was going to significantly challenge local norms. I don't think that would serve any purposes. Frankly, there are so many texts to teach that none of us can teach everything we would like to teach. I when I was teaching, I had a list of books, both young adult and classic, that I always thought I would love to teach this book. I'm so sorry that I can't. And it wasn't that I couldn't in the community. It was that I just didn't have time, or another grade was teaching it, or something else. So if there is a book that you think, you know what, I really think this is going to upset a significant group of parents, don't teach that book. Part of being culturally reflective is respecting the culture in which you're teaching. And if you are trying, and I sometimes sort of push back a little bit to people because I hear this sometimes with for perspective, not just prospective teachers, but teacher educators, and they say things like, "Well, we really need for our students to change the culture." And I think that's a very, I don't think that's a good idea because I think it's not something that these people would talk about for other cultures. So, for example, they're talking about sort of the white majority American culture, right? Um, they would never say, "Oh, I'm preparing my students to go teach in inner city Chicago because I want them to change Black American culture." We would never say, "I'm preparing students to teach on a reservation because I want them to change indigenous culture." Like that sounds horrible. And it is horrible. And it's the same thing if someone says, "Well, yeah, I'm sending out students to teach in rural North Dakota or rural Montana or rural Minnesota, and I want them to change the culture." What? You're supposed to respect local cultures. Now, obviously, as a community member, if you think things in your community need to change, that's your right. And I'm not saying that teachers don't even play a role in that, but you should respect cultural norms. I respected cultural norms, and I think you should too. I never had a parent or guardian complain about a book I taught or a book that was in my classroom library, as far as I know. I suppose it's possible that they complained to each other or they, complained even to the principal, and the principal said, "I'm not doing anything about it." Um, if that happened, I don't know about it. Frankly, if parents and guardians like you, they are less likely to complain. And again, some of that comes with respecting local culture. Similarly, if your students are happy and parents and guardians think they're learning in your class, they're less likely to complain. They might look at it and say, I don't know if I like that book, but oh well. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that won't happen. And I should point out that I taught in high poverty schools. And in high poverty schools, many parents and guardians had other priorities than school. Like they were often in survival mode. And if their student was going to school and was doing well in school, um, they were not likely to complain unless the student came home complaining. It is different, obviously, in other types of communities where I did not teach other than student teaching or subbing in some cases. So I'm also very aware of that. Like I taught in Wichita, I taught in Las Vegas, Nevada, I taught in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, and two of those areas are very urban. I taught in sort of very diverse inner city schools there. Um, I may have had different reactions if I were teaching in a suburban school, and I recognize that. But I still think that if parents fundamentally like you, and if your students are happy with your class and their parents or guardians think they're learning in your class, there aren't going to be complaints. Now, when I say students are happy in class, I don't mean you need to try to make your students like you. And I don't mean you need to be your student's friend. You are not your student's friend. Students have friends their own age. You are not in that role. But if you are a mean, if you're a mean teacher and your students dislike you, they're going to complain about you. And if they complain about you because of meanness, parents are going to complain. Don't be mean. Don't be a jerk. Be firm. Be assertive. Be a warm demander. Opt-outs are okay. Be ready for someone who requests a different text. And it's okay if a student does. You don't need to say your parent needs to request that. If you are passing out Huckleberry Finn and a student says, I've heard the N-word is in that book and I don't want to read it, say, okay, here. You don't make a big deal about it. And you shouldn't. You shouldn't point that student out. You definitely shouldn't say, well, I guess we can't read that book because so-and-so doesn't want to read it. Like, please don't do that. Similarly, if parents get upset, simply say, I have an alternate. They can read that. Don't make a big deal about it. Allow for students, again, allow for choice when considering discussing, a controversial book. So we're reading, I don't know, Fahrenheit 451 is on the most banned book list for some reason. And maybe I have a student who's opted out and we're going to have a Socratic seminar over it. And I'm going to tell that student, I'm going to give them a choice. I'm going to say, we're going to discuss this book. You haven't read it. I know you didn't want to read it or your parents didn't want you to read it. You can stay in class if you want and work on other work. It's not free time, right? You can work on the book you're reading instead. You could also, if it's okay with the librarian, go to the library and work on it while we're discussing. Come back in 20 minutes. Opting out is a right and it shouldn't be mocked. It shouldn't be derided. Respect that. For whatever reason, and the reason they want to opt out doesn't matter. So yeah, let them opt out. It's okay. So and this is another reason maybe my parents didn't complain, is that I did opt outs rather than opt ins. So I'll talk about this in the final slide when I talk about some of the books that I taught. There were a couple of books there was one book in particular I was very concerned about. And I sent home permission slips, but they weren't permission slips. They were, we are going to read this book in class. If you would prefer your student not to read this book, please sign this and return it with your student. So it wasn't permission to read it. It was a request not to read it. Now, some districts don't let you do that. You have to send a note home to be opted in. And that's unfortunate, I think. This was really beneficial, I think, because if a kid forgot or something else, like it worked really well. So here's what I taught. Now this is primarily either the young adult books I taught and or the books that are on sometimes some of the most challenged lists or that are potentially controversial. So it wasn't everything I taught when I taught middle and high school. So I use PowerPoint to close caption things. I record using Camtasia from TechSmith. I really like Camtasia. Unfortunately, it's only a subscription product now, but I've kind of been grandfathered in. But it's also for me worthwhile to have a subscription because I teach so much online. Um, I love Camtasia. However, Camtasia's closed captions they aren't quite as accurate as PowerPoints, and they don't always populate like I want them to do. Like I want them to. However, PowerPoint's closed captioning sometimes does turn off unexpectedly. So, a little tip for you if you're using closed captioning in PowerPoint, one is that sometimes closed captions won't work if you don't have your PowerPoint saved, I have noticed. And another, here what I had to do was quit PowerPoint and go back into it. Like it was not responding. So, um, I'm going to actually re-record what I just talked about. It, so captions are available so I don't get yelled at by anybody. So this is a list of books that I've taught that are potentially controversial. Again, it's not all books I've taught. Like I taught, Romeo and Juliet, and I taught the Odyssey. I taught The Age of Innocence. I taught Night, which actually might be on here as a controversial book. Um, but here are some of the books I taught in middle and high school that are potentially controversial. Again, I don't think I ever had issues with them with parents or guardians. One is The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. This is controversial for a bunch of reasons, some of which now relate to the author himself. Alexie had some allegations against him about misconduct a few years ago. Right during COVID or after COVID kind of is when they emerged. But even before that, the book was controversial because it includes various types of racial slurs in it. It also includes some sexual content, not so much in terms of sex itself. It's sexual sort of thoughts of these, frankly, horny high school kids. Um, those are things I talked about. I've used a lot of books that have naughty words in them, and when I talked about that with students, even in middle school, even in elementary school, I taught like fifth grade. I would say that I would say there are words in here that we don't want you to say, but you know what? You have heard them before. I know you've heard them before. Don't say them. The fact that somebody is saying them doesn't mean that you should. And we would talk about why does an author have characters say a naughty word? And we talked about the fact that because people do say them, that is something that adds realism. Obviously, not everyone does. Some people choose not to. And it was always fun. Looking for Alaska is by John Green. It's a great book. I think I mentioned this in another video, but I'm not sure is this course or another course. This is something where it helps know your students. I'm trying not to have any spoilers, um, but there is an incident of suicide in the book. And I had a student who I can't remember now if the student had attempted suicide or if the student had a friend who either had attempted or who had committed suicide. And I knew this student, no matter what, had some mental health struggles. And so I simply asked her, I said, we're going to read this book. I'm a little concerned because I know you've had some issues. Um, and I want it to be comfortable for you. And if it's not comfortable for you, that's okay. I have another book for you to read. It was all ready to go. Why don't if you want, you can take this book home over the weekend and skim it to see if it's going to work for you or not. Or you can just decide not to, or to, like whatever you want. And I think if I remember right, she took the book home. I don't know what she did, but she said, I don't think I don't think I can handle this book. I'm like, that's perfectly fine. You're going to read this instead. And it worked out perfectly. Truly, it worked out just fine. How I Live Now is a book that I absolutely love, but it's post-apocalyptic, and it has well, frankly, it has some cousin loving in it, and I don't know that it has been actually on the most challenged list, but maybe it should be. To Kill a Mockingbird is challenged from both the left and the right for various reasons. Obviously, it's not traditional young adult literature, but because its protagonist is a young person, it is often considered that. Fahrenheit 451, as I've mentioned, Of Mice and Men. And then two works by Chris Crutcher, who is one of my favorite young adult authors, Staying Fat for Sarah Burns and Chinese Handcuffs. Most years with my freshmen, I taught Staying Fat for Sarah Burns. I eventually got tired of it, and so I taught Chinese Handcuffs one year just so I'd have something else to teach. This was the book of all of these I was most concerned about. This is one of the ones where I sent that note saying, hey, we're going to read this book, and I want you to be aware of it. And if you don't want them to, that's cool. We can do something else. And Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, which is a brilliant and beautiful and thoughtful book, and I absolutely love it. Um, it has real conversations, and it has real conversations about controversial issues, including abortion. And that was something I was really concerned about because although I was teaching in a diverse urban school, um, I had a couple of students who were very, very conservative, and the majority of students were, and I should say the majority, a couple of students were very, very conservative. Some students were quite liberal, and the majority of students probably didn't care either way because they were freshmen. Um, and so I was particularly concerned with one particular kid who I frankly didn't really like. Um, Not because of his viewpoints. Frankly, at times I agreed with his viewpoints, um, but because his viewpoints were overly extreme, which I did not agree with, and he was not particularly polite about sharing them, which I also found really annoying. Um, and so I was frankly really concerned, and he was one of the ones I was most concerned about because even though I disagree with his viewpoints, I didn't want to offend. Like, there's no reason for me to offend him. Like, that's not my role or my job. And he was completely fine with the book. Um, and I was surprised because they had in the book debates about abortion in this one of the classes that they had in this high school, um, where both sides kind of were given. And the author, I think, is pretty clearly on the pro-choice side. And I was concerned how this kid might feel about that just in general, and it was fine. Again, Chinese Handcuffs, same thing. Both these books are also controversial because they deal with things like abuse. Um, Lois Lowry's The Giver is controversial for a variety of reasons. Um, Hinton's The Outsiders. The Chocolate War. So I kind of taught the Chocolate War by accident when I taught seventh grade in my advanced skills class. I had a class set that was left in my classroom, and so I thought if I have a class set, I must be, I'm going to teach this book because I love the book. But I hadn't read the book for several years, and I forgot about how explicit it is in places. Um, and so I did not send a note home or anything like that. And I was sort of reading a chapter ahead of the kids, and we got to a chapter where um, one of the characters goes into the boys' bathroom where he opens up a stall where another character is pleasuring himself and snaps a picture, essentially. And I read that and I was like, I can't, like, I cannot have seventh graders read this. Like, I'm going to be fired, even though it's Wichita. I'm still going to be fired. Um, and so I told them, I tried not to lie to my students, and I said, this next whatever chapter it is, I said there's stuff in here that I think is controversial. I don't think it's fully appropriate for a seventh grader, and so I am going to summarize the chapter for you, what you need to know, and I'm going to leave out the controversial things. And again, they all have their own copy of the book, so I said I'm not going to stop you from reading the chapter. You are capable of reading it or not, but I want you to be aware that we aren't going to discuss the elements of this chapter. You are free to skip this chapter. Here's what you need to know about it. And a couple of the boys in my class came up to me like a day later and said, well, we can't figure out why you skipped that chapter, Mr. Jones. Is it because they were smoking? Because they were also smoking. They're not the main character, I don't think, but like it said someone was smoking in the bathroom. And I said, well, yeah, maybe that was probably part of it. And I just moved on. They had the sort of the sexual stuff kind of went over their heads, which um, is I think a good thing to keep in mind that very often sort of explicit material in books, students who aren't students who don't already have a background in that explicit material are often going to ignore it or just read by it. Bridge Terabithia is controversial for there's some language issues in it. One of the characters very much questions religion and God. And there is, not to have a spoiler, but I'll just say there is a death in the book. And then Ender's Game. I would teach Ender's Game to my freshmen. I taught gifted freshmen many years. And Ender's Game is a science fiction novel by Orson Scott Card, and it's about highly gifted individuals and what they go through a little bit. And I thought it was something that my students could relate to. It wasn't controversial when I taught it. Since then, it's become controversial only because its author, Orson Scott Card, has made controversial statements about gay people, essentially. Um, and as with Sherman Alexie, as a rule, I don't consider that. I don't usually consider the viewpoints of the authors when I choose to teach a book or not. Um, I know, for example, that J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame has recently been controversial because of comments she's made that have been portrayed as being anti-trans. Um, I don't teach Harry Potter, but it has nothing to do with that. I just have never liked the book. I didn't dislike it when I read. I only read the first one, and I thought it was really. I thought it was derivative fantasy. I thought other authors did it a lot better. I thought like part of it was just, it was so reminiscent, parts of it, to Roald Dahl's Matilda, even though it was magical and Matilda, wasn't per se, but that whole school setting, that was very Matilda-esque. And the magical parts of it were so reminiscent, I'll say, of Terry Pratchett, another British author, the best-selling contemporary British author before J.K. Rowling, and in my opinion, a far better author. And I just found it personally really derivative. And I never taught it. I never wanted to teach it. I still had a copy of it in my classroom library. The copy that I bought and read and didn't particularly like. And it's not that I disliked it. I was like, meh. It was a meh book for me. I still had it in my classroom library. And I still would today if I were back in the classroom. There's nothing wrong with the book. It is controversial because all fantasy tends to be controversial with some parents of certain religious beliefs, if it has magic in it. And so Harry Potter was controversial because of that. And then it's become controversial from another perspective since then because of comments that Rowling has put. But again, for me, the comments or the actions of the author are usually not things I think about for the book. I think that's true for classic works as well. Like many of the books that we teach or have read, we probably would not really want to hang out and be friends with their authors. I'm willing to bet that lots of them think things or thought things now that we would find really repugnant. So I try to judge a book by the book itself and it's how I perceive its quality as being, rather than of things that the author may have said or done. Obviously, you may feel differently, and that's fine. Like I've said, there is such a huge amount of text out there for you to teach and choose from that if you are uncomfortable with something that Rowling said or that Alexie allegedly did or whatever, or if you think that Crutcher's work is not valid, don't put it in your classroom. That's fine, or don't teach it. I would say that doesn't mean it shouldn't necessarily be in your classroom library. Again, just like Harry Potter was in mine. I'll talk more about classroom libraries in another video. I think that, like I said, Harry Potter was in mud in the closed captioning. Love PowerPoint closed captioning. Harry Potter in mine, as in my classroom library, not in mud. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope I did not upset too many of you in this last part of it. If you have questions or thoughts or comments, please reach out. Have a good week.